the major changes for those of you to work out for. And I think rather than go through the list of all of the changes, is to really look at what were the priorities. And the argument that the U.S. made coming into this negotiation was that we needed to shut the back door to China. And the back door for China through Canada and Mexico. And so the major provisions in there dealing with that were auto rules of origin, which I'll jump into some detail in just a moment, but also dealing with dispute resolution, that Canada and Mexico would not bring claims under NAFTA for what the U.S. has done on steel and the 301 intellectual property provisions. So while dispute resolution got a great deal of attention during the negotiations, in terms of practical impact for all of you, there's probably very little. Most of those have stayed the same. The sunset clause I mentioned, which is we'll review every 16 years. We didn't do too much on government procurement by America, except as many of you saw, there is a new executive order on Buy America or Buy American that's worth a read. And then there are provisions in the new USMCA dealing with state-owned enterprises, currency, and also a provision in there that says if any one of the three countries goes and cuts a deal with a non-market economy, meaning China or its proxies, that they have to notify the other two, and the other two can back out of the deal and still keep their deal with each other. So the whole idea there is to try to prevent Mexico and Canada from dealing with China or doing a trade deal. And the whole idea there is, making sure that North America stays North American. Next slide, please. And so the next set of priorities was to make it as difficult to manufacture in Mexico as possible. So obviously the auto rules of origin are important. Chapter 11, which was a mechanism in place that if you felt that the U.S. felt encouraged investment in Mexico, that you could bring claims for discriminatory treatment, expropriation, et cetera. That's been eliminated with respect to Canada. It now may only be used with Mexico if you have a government contract and in certain sectors. So the whole idea right there is that the U.S. isn't going to underwrite the political risk of investment in Mexico. Labor issues, dealing with agriculture, the great tomato wars between Florida and Mexico were a priority area, and then rules of origin and tariff rate quotas under textiles. So those fell in. So there was a very Mexico-driven target, and this is where we saw most of the action. Next slide, please. And so when we move into some of the more technical side, the automotive aspect had three key areas. How do we make sure that the automotive sector remains primarily North American? Secondly, what do we do with auto components that don't comply with the new rules of origin? The default right now, as many of you know, is if you don't comply, it's 2.5 most favored nation %. And then if the U.S. does put Section 232 auto tariffs on, how could Mexico and Canada have a guarantee? Because as you saw earlier, autos are citizens of North America, so we'd end up shooting our industry in the foot. Just moving ahead, Adam, we can move pretty much on the quick step here now. So the automotive rules of origin, as many of you saw, have gone from 62.5% at the top line to 75%. There's a new methodology, however. 40% of that labor, the labor component, 40% of the labor value content must be made at $16 an hour. So that doesn't mean that Mexico has to pay $16 an hour. It means that as we're tracing the components through, 40% of the labor value content needs to come from places where we pay $16 an hour. The effect of this is not that we'll see companies lifting up stakes from Mexico and moving back to the United States and Canada. What we're seeing already is the auto companies are looking to start sourcing potentially more on the supply chain from Canada and Mexico to bump up those levels and their specific credits for R&D and labor force, et cetera. Additionally, at the OEM level, so at the Detroit 3 or Honda or Nissan or whoever, 70% of the steel and aluminum has to be certified from North America. And then if there's a transition phase, if you can move to the next slide, where the biggest change for those of you that may be operating in the auto sector is where we largely were looking at a world that had 60 to 62.5%, and we just had to look at what did not count, right? So we were always looking around, are we at that 40% threshold and everything else? We're pretty much good. And The USMCA actually requires you to now trace virtually every component. So you're going to need to be working with Scarbrough and others, or your legal counsel, et cetera, because some parts are identified as core parts, some are principal parts and complementary parts, and that list is detailed in the NAFTA. But you see there's different thresholds. Core parts are at 75, 70% for principal, 65 for complementary. So instead of kind of winging it, as we've been all known to do from time to time, I know that's coming from North America, you actually need to get down to the part level and see where that is. And that's why it's going to be critical to start preparing for this, but also as the uniform regulations are developed for the USMCA once ratified, to pay attention. The biggest question we're getting right now is, wait a minute, I make lamps. Do I have to know where every piece of wire in that headlight or in that tire comes from? Because we didn't before. We kind of knew it was more, but it wasn't enough to make a difference. Now you're going to have to really trace these parts. There's also no deemed, so, you know, the electrical components and other things, there's no deemed originating in North America anymore either. So it's very important for your supply chain. Next slide, please, and we'll start moving to some out of autos into other areas. As I said earlier, Mexico did get a guarantee, as did Canada, that if you don't comply with the new rule of origin, that a certain level, basically current production and some to grow on, will maintain the MFN in case the U.S. ever raises most favored nation, which is rumored to be in the talks. Next slide, please. And then for Section 232, as you know, the U.S. is talking about doing 2.2 auto tariffs. That report is sitting on the president's desk. He has 90 days in which to decide. So if we start putting 25% on foreign auto imports to the United States, Mexico and Canada are largely going to be exempted to that up to certain thresholds. So they got a guarantee. And that's also in a side letter, so it doesn't require congressional ratification. So largely the Mexican and Canadian auto industry are safe no matter what the president decides. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, now, what are some other areas? A big issue in this was for dairy farmers. Dairy farmers that may have issues with Canada, there have been new access for those that may have, that your companies may be exporting dairy into Canada. It should make it a little bit easier. But the U.S. also gave up some things on sugar and a few other places. So some of the agricultural rules of origin are changed. It's worth, I've talked earlier about the drug, the pharmaceutical provisions, and steel, the 25% 232 tariffs on steel. Mexican and Canadian steel do remain in place, notwithstanding the fact that we've guaranteed 75% of that in the auto industry. Just a quick note on 232s. We do think the 232s on Mexico and Canada will be resolved sometime this spring. It's not a question if, it's a question of when. Canada and Mexico are really pushing for that to happen right now. But our intelligence is that may stay on a bit longer because that's going to be leverage in the negotiations with Congress. Next slide, please. For those of you that are moving into other sectors as well that have been impacted, I mentioned Chapter 19 stays, intellectual property. There's been some modernization in there. Also, for any of you worried about NAFTA's immigration system, it's basically stayed the same, which is kind of a downer because many of us know it's not working very well right now. So TN visas, for example, at the same time, there was a push actually during the negotiations to eliminate NAFTA's immigration system. So the ability just to keep what we had is considered a win in and of itself. Next slide, please. Sunset clause I talked about, concurrency. Next slide after that.
Oops, sorry.
Nope, you're fine. Next slide. So, and some of the things that actually receive very little attention but should be good news stories. Digital trade. So for those of you in the e-commerce, we're dealing with technology. There's not going to be tariffs and duties in North America on electronic transmission. Some of you likely saw that France has just proposed a 3% tariff on digital trade. We now have a platinum standard digital trade provision in the USMCA, which is even stronger than what was in the TPP. De minimis, some of you I know use de minimis thresholds of the $800 in the US. One of the big asks for the US was for Canada and Mexico to raise to $800. We didn't get there, And I will note that this is an area that is still arguably being negotiated because what we ended up with in the deal that was signed was basically not a great scenario for anybody because yes, Canada and Mexico partly raised their thresholds, but that was good news to the retail industry in those countries because it didn't go all the way up to 800. The downside is we now have 3 different levels of de minimis, which is very difficult to administer. So we're going to maybe see some changes on that, maybe aligning the various numbers, because as you can see, one of the interesting pieces is US dollars versus Canadian dollars. So you get the Canadian thresholds in there. So I think we may see some movement on that in the coming weeks and months. Next slide, please. And mindful of the time here, for those of you that are in the chemicals industry, there are new rules of origin for chemicals that actually are significant upgrades. As you know, in the past, we used to have to trace basically where every molecule came from. Now it's basically where the product is mixed or produced. So that should be good news for companies working in those sectors or have customers in those sectors. And there's been great news on customs and trade facilitation. Tiffany talked at the outset about the work that NASCO has done on borders. A lot of that has been incorporated into USMCA. There's a reduced need for certificates of origin. In fact, certificates of origin in certain sectors have been eliminated. There's a strong focus on technology. This idea where, certain ports of entry, particularly with Mexico, you can only use certain brokers or not. We all know what that was about. That's been eliminated. And for customs audits, particularly with Mexico, this was a big issue in terms of us as the business community. All of a sudden you get a letter that Mexico's coming to audit you, greater transparency in how those audit procedures work, how long record retention needs to be for. And when I said focus on technology too, some of it is, where you used to have to submit forms to Mexico and elsewhere in the original with raised seals and all of that's being eliminated. Again, that's going to take time, so don't walk out of here today saying, hey, I don't need to do what I'm doing with Mexico yet. But I think this is aspirational, but it puts us in the right direction. Next slide, please. Other areas one of the things that maybe got cut off there is, in addition to chemicals, there are new rules on textiles. They largely keep most of the original NAFTA, but for those of you that may be dealing with textiles, fabrics, seat covers, sewing, threads, take a look at it. It's largely the same, but there are little nuances in there. So my biggest fear right now is just on this last slide is kind of the 3.